Good morning, and on behalf of Hudson Institute, I would like to welcome all of those who have joined us online and in person today for the defining partnership of the 21st century US-India relations. This event is the first in a series of conversations that are part of the Motwani-Jadeja US-India Dialogue Series. As the world's oldest and largest democracies, the United States and India constitute key anchor points of the democratic world, having significantly deepened their partnership over the last 3 decades. The core of the relationship remains shared values and strong people-to-people ties. This enduring relationship is marked by a deepening commercial partnership based on mutual commitment to economic engagement. Over the last 2 decades, defense relations have evolved, shared security interests, and a commitment to a free, open, inclusive, and rules-based international order. To discuss US relations with India, we are fortunate to have with us today my senior colleague, Walter Russell Mead, who is Ravenel B. Curry III Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at Hudson Institute, the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College, and the Global View columnist at Wall Street Journal. Walter, you have written one of the defining books on American foreign policy, Special Providence. Since the end of the Second World War, American grand strategy has focused on defending the American people, their way of life, and their allies. How would you define the world order today? And in this US-led world order, what role does India play in the minds of American policymakers?
Good questions. And I have to say, by the way, before we get started, that if this were a real panel on India, it would be me asking Aparna a lot of very stupid and naive questions, because I just want to say right at the beginning, I am a beginner when it comes to trying to understand India, and I suspect I will never actually graduate to black belt in India studies, but I'm working on it. Yeah, after World War II, what is it, Winston Churchill once said, not a popular name to drop in India, I've learned. Winston Churchill once said that you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. And what really happened after World War II, the Americans had gone through World War I, a Great Depression, World War II, and then just a couple of years after World War II, Stalin is trying to push Soviet hegemony across Europe. And at this point, finally, the Americans sort of really wake up and say, okay, wait, what do we need? And also, of course, we need to secure our interests, our commerce, our freedom without having a nuclear war. So it was this double interest that we had. We ended up building a lot of institutions with a great deal of help. At the time, the European countries, this was very early in the decolonization process. So it was still a time when sort of if London, Paris, and Washington were in agreement, well, that, there you had it. So working primarily with these countries, we worked to set up a set of institutions, financial, political, and tried to introduce some norms into the international system, while at the same time, I think, maintaining something of a balance of power strategy, prevent the Soviet Union from dominating Europe, prevent either the Soviet Union or Mao's China from dominating Asia, keep your eye on Germany and Japan, make sure they don't try anything again. And that was the origin of the system. After 1990, with the fall of the Soviet Union, I think we got a little bit ambitious, a little bit ahead on our skis, and thought, okay, well, just like West Germany is going to try to turn East Germany into West Germany after the Cold War, we will globalize the institutions, globalize the norms and practices that had bound together the, quote, free world, and it was not all a free world, I can assure you, during the Cold War. That effort, I think Washington underestimated the difficulty of it, as did many of our powers, our allies. And over time, it's become clear that what we had bitten off more than we could chew, and that the United States lacks both the wisdom and the will for that kind of massive global transformation. And at the same time, I think we discovered that, or some of us are probably still beginning to discover or have yet to discover, that while in the second half of the 20th century, it seemed that economic development was creating convergence, so that the world was becoming more similar. Cultural differences, civilizational differences were diminishing in impact on politics. Actually, in the 21st century, we've seen something different, where different civilizations, different identities, different sort of religions even, have been moving apart. They have different visions of how they will use technology to develop their societies, build up their power, and achieve the things that are important to them. So what we now have, I think, is a multipolar system, which is not just multipolar in terms of geopolitics, though it certainly is, and that's a rather serious concern, but it's multipolar civilizationally and culturally. And it's probably not going to get less. So you can have a country like Turkey, which is a NATO ally of the United States, but clearly in many ways is going off in what to the president of Turkey and many of his supporters feel is a more authentically Turkish direction, rather than trying to follow Ataturk into Europe. And to some degree, I think I see what's happening in India as related to this.
This ties in perfectly with what I was going to ask you next, which is that India has never been comfortable with either a bipolar or a unipolar world order, and India has long sought a multipolar world order. For the last decade, many in India claim what you stated, that the multipolar world order will become a reality. From your conversations with Indian policymakers and strategists, how do you see that India plans on building this or enhancing this multipolar world order, and what role does India see for itself in this order?
Yeah, it has been very interesting. Since the pandemic, really, I've had the opportunity to get to know more of the people involved in India policy in India. And this would include, thanks to you, we had Mr. Gandhi here speaking at Hudson. I've also met with the head of the RSS, with the Prime Minister. So and many intellectuals and writers who take all kinds of different positions on Indian politics. So I'm trying to pull this together. But what I hear basically is that in the BJP and actually in the RSS leadership, there is a sense that economic growth is what India must do. In a way, you could say they are feeling what we could call a Meiji moment, that Japan, in the 19th century, after trying to wall itself off from external influence, suddenly confronted the technology, the Industrial Revolution, and they realized, if we don't master this, if we don't learn to play this game well, we are going to be crushed. And I think India has, in recent decades, come to the realization, first of all, that it can succeed in international economic competition, which many Indians did not believe 30 years ago, that India can win if it has a level playing field. But also, particularly today, in light of what they see as hostile Chinese activity and presence and Chinese hegemonic ambitions across Asia, the Indians feel we cannot allow ourselves to be eclipsed. China, I use the statistic a lot. In 1980, India's GDP was about 65% of China's GDP. Today, India's GDP is about 17% of China's. And in that delta, you can see a great deal of the geopolitical and economic imbalances that have created a lot of instability across Asia. And so the idea of trying to close that gap has become extremely important. Now, this is in some ways a complicated agenda. First of all, everything in India is complicated, given the number of cultures, the number of, you have people that are still living in very traditional ways in villages, and you have super modern citizens of the world zipping around in jets in the great cities. You have cyber industry, and you have people waiting for the monsoon rains to see if their onion crop is going to come in. So to say that India is one thing or has one approach, however, for the Hindutva folks, Hinduism did not originate as a methodology of economic development. Although I think actually in contrast to some other religions, there is more in Hindu scriptures about the economics of management. There's so many holy books in India, but some of them actually have to do with treatises on how a king should manage the economic affairs of the state in order to achieve power. So how do you then take a religiously and culturally grounded movement which sees the essence of Indian unity in this civilization, Hindu civilization, originating in pre-modern times, pre-industrial times, how can that become a unifying and activating basis for a society going through the extraordinary and wrenching changes that modernization inevitably brings? And I think my sense is that this is the question that a lot of very senior people in India come back to over and over again as they look at the world and try to figure out what to do next.
Thank you. India and the United States have different histories. They're situated in different geographies. And yet India is one of those countries, extremely rare today, that has retained bipartisan consensus among American policymakers, whether Democrat or Republican. Every American president for the last 3 decades has sought closer relations and actually traveled to India. What accounts for this abiding American interest in India, considering India was never a member of the Western Bloc, never been a security ally? And if I could add something, which is, what impact do you think this year's presidential elections will have on this partnership? Do you think it will make any difference who becomes president?
Well, I would say the reason Americans have a bipartisan consensus, although again, you use the word, we're not as complicated as India, but we're kind of complicated. There are a lot of different strands in something that we call a consensus. So the Cold War consensus could include George McGovern and Ronald Reagan in some ways. So the India consensus is broad, and there are different emphasis in it. But I'd say the main reason that we have something like a consensus on India is because we are not stupid. That is, we can look at world events. We can see that China in particular threatens the balance of power and threatens the independence of many states that we rely on a great deal, that its economic and commercial interests, on top of its military interests, are often quite sharply at variance with our own. And yet we do not want a war with China. And so you ask yourself, well, how could the Indo-Pacific evolve and develop in ways that would avoid a U.S.-China war and yet also forestall a Chinese drive for hegemony, a successful Chinese drive for hegemony? And the answer, I think, it's very hard to come up with an answer that doesn't include India. Whether you're thinking of that in simple security terms, or I think more constructively in political and cultural terms. If India achieves the kind of economic growth that enables it to play the role that its size and its history and its culture entitle it to in the Indo-Pacific, Asia, the Indo-Pacific will be too big for any country to dominate, even China or for that matter, even India. If India were to become extremely ambitious, power has been known to go to the heads of other people in other countries. I could mention perhaps my own. From the American point of view, that's not a partisan thing that I've just said. And actually, it's not directly related to how India behaves on every issue. It's just a general strategic vision that, by and large, what's good for India is good for the United States, and perhaps vice versa. That's a pretty strong foundation. Now, as to what would happen if President Trump returns to the White House, in his first term, President Trump enjoyed very close relations with India. He and the Prime Minister had an extremely good relationship. I would imagine, more of the same, although, President Trump is, he's unpredictable. But I do think that he will want reciprocity. He will not want India to repeat, in a sense, what China did, which was to become a superpower in large part by cheating on issues like IP, WTO rules, state subsidies, and so on. And so I could see friction developing over this. But I think the goal would be to get to yes, to get to deals rather than to get to an impasse.
Thank you. In the words of Lord Palmerston, British Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. From the beginning, shared values have been at the core of the US-India partnership. However, today, the two countries share similar interests in the strategic realm. For example, the threat from China. If the two countries want a long-term strategic partnership, do you think it matters whether it's based on shared values or shared interests? I'm sure you understand why I'm asking. There are many people who ask this question, that is it only the China factor which brings India and US together, or are there shared values which are deeper than just the temporary shared interests?
Well, I would say that there are deeper connections than simply an anti-China club. And again, I'd like to remind people that, at least in my view, the foundation of the American-India relationship is not how do we win a war with China, but how do we avoid a war with China without accepting all of China's hegemonic claims. So that in that sense, as I see it, at the foundation of the relationship is a joint wish for peace and a joint belief that the economic development of India, better living for more Indian people, greater opportunity for more Indians, is in the deepest interest of both countries. Now, so there is clearly a value component here. Now, beyond that, there's a sense, there are other things that make it easier for Indians and Americans sometimes to understand each other than one might expect, given the very obvious differences. One of them is that we are both federal states, and we are federal in a sense, not because necessarily that's the most efficient way in an abstract political science textbook, but because our domestic diversity is such that we could not function in any other way. That Vermont and Alabama cannot be forced to live in a straitjacket, but neither can Kerala and Uttar Pradesh. So there's a sense, and I would go from federalism to pluralism, that we both understand that our unity has to rest on a respect for and appreciation for pluralism, and that many voices have to talk before a decision can be reached. That is sometimes maddeningly inefficient It drives us crazy. It often drives the people that we are dealing with in other countries crazy. And I may say India has as much potential to annoy its interlocutors as America does, and for very similar reasons. So here what I see is, again, India is a Hindu-based civilization. In America, the greatest historical force has been Christianity with an overlay of the Enlightenment. Those are very different. On the other hand, I have an Indian American asking me on a platform in the words of a British Prime Minister, framing her question that way. So we both have a certain colonial heritage in common. So yes, now, when it comes, though, to the functioning of democracy, we don't always see things the same way. And I think here is something that we really are going to have to get much deeper into. In some ways, in American terms, a respect for pluralism sort of leads us very quickly to things like a respect for religious diversity. We have a lot of Hindu temples being built in the United States, and a lot of Hindus speaking to their friends and neighbors about the spiritual values that they uphold. And we have even Indian American women marrying American men and vice versa. This does not actually trigger certain kinds of concerns that it does in India, given India's very different history. And so issues, and this is just one of a number of issues that I could point to. The question then is, how can America, the American tendency when we perceive a difference is to get on a high horse and begin to lecture from a position of unquestioned moral superiority. May I say that India is much the same. This is actually one of our similarities, is a love of instructing the ignorant. And so when you have two people who share this taste, they can quarrel. So I think on both sides, what we're going to have to do is develop people-to-people relations, institution-to-institution relations, where we can begin to work out this, not that we're ever necessarily going to come to similar policies on everything or agree on everything, but we have a sense of what we're doing, and we're each trying to do things that we're trying to not to unnecessarily introduce difficulties into the relationship.
Thank you. That was my second question, but you answered it. It was on, do you think democracy and the fact that, neither country is living up to its democratic and constitutional ideals, will that cause any estrangement in the relationship or tensions?
Well, let me say that, again, I think Americans, first of all, when I say Americans, I'm often just speaking of myself here. I reached a rather advanced age with only a very superficial understanding of Indian history. Like many educated Americans, the story of Gandhi I found absolutely fascinating, inspiring. And then it got kind of depressing with the partition, and then but neither before nor since that one sort of shining career did I have any serious understanding of India. And one of the things that I've found as I've begun to study post-independence Indian history is the degree, just how, both communal and political violence in this enormous country with more diversity as well as more people, more cultural and in linguistic diversity than Europe, has actually, it's been by European standards, it's been extraordinarily peaceful history. If you compare the history of India to the history of the Balkans or the history of the French and the Germans. But communal violence, sectarian violence, tensions inside and out. And so India has had long-running guerrilla insurgencies, internal insurgencies, things that, again, most Americans, even many American policymakers, simply don't know. So there's an American tendency to look at India and say, why can't you just be Denmark? And it's not going to be Denmark, but also to attribute any divergence between the actual India and the actual Denmark to some ill will, shortcoming, or poor morals of the Indian government. And this would be true whether one spoke of a Congress government or a BJP government. And that this is not to say that one can't make criticisms of things that happen in India. One can, and at times perhaps one should, though I think, as an American, one should, again, think very hard about when is it really time to get up on that high horse. But it is, one has to begin with an understanding of this complexity and of this history. And one cannot simply say that because there is a riot in this town, okay, the Indian national government has failed in some way, or was either behind the violence or its inadequacies contributed. The miracle of modern India is that it has held together so well and so peacefully, even though India's history since 1947 has been far more tumultuous than that of the United States.
Thank you. One final question before that, just remind the audience if you have any questions. Once Walter answers the final question, I'll turn to all of you. For decades, the key pegs of the US-India partnership, as you know, have been commercial, people to people, and strategic, defense, military. Is there any area of this partnership that in your eyes has yet to be explored? And if so, what would that be?
Well, one thing I think there is a mismatch in a way in the relationship that in India, the people who study the United States or who are interested in the United States tend to be people who are also interested generally in India's place in the world and at very senior levels of Indian business. Until recently, and to some degree even today, people in the world of American foreign policy, but also in some other divisions, who study India are seen as India specialists rather than generalists who feel the need to understand India deeply as part of their responsibility as generalist policy intellectuals, thought leaders, whatever terms you want to use. And so what you often find in these situations is that you have a community in America that's actually quite India literate, of scholars, of journalists, of development professionals, and I could go on and on. But they are generally speaking not all that active in the general conversation about American national strategy, American trade policy, or whatever. It's sort of, okay, now it's time to call the India person in, and let's hear about that, and now goodbye, thank you, we'll get on with it. Okay, that is not an appropriate basis. That kind of thing in the United States will not bear the weight that U.S.-India relations are going to impose on our structures. So part of what I think, when I try to think, okay, what can we do constructively to prepare for the future? I think we need to find ways to increase the level of India sophistication among the next generations of senior policymakers. And one would hope that Jake Sullivan's successors would be people who were deeply knowledgeable about India, not because they were India specialists, but because at every stage in their educational and professional development, it was taken for granted by all the people around them that this is just one of those things that you have to know. And how do we do that? I think certainly we at Hudson are looking at ways to try to get more senior Americans and those who will become senior over time, have the capability and the ambition and so on, get them to begin to be grounded in this relationship and in Indian reality. What they'll come up with, what ideas they'll have, I can't possibly know. But for the last 30 years, a lot of Americans were waking up and saying, oh my gosh, Asia is really going to be important in the future. So they would immediately go to China and study Mandarin and immerse themselves in Chinese history. And I'm glad we have a lot of people who have done this. It's a tremendous benefit to us. But for every 100 who said, I'm going to China, whether it's for business or for politics or whatever it might be, all right, how many went to India? Maybe one or two? All right. It needs to be 50-50. We need a larger American group who understand India, but also are plugged into our national strategic and political debates. That, I think, is the only way to keep this relationship strong, given what will inevitably be difficult moments. And I'll just conclude with this before we go to questions. I think on both sides, there is a misleading belief that as the relationship becomes closer, it will be marked by fewer arguments. That's actually not how things work. I observe the U.S.-Israel relationship, which is a very, very close and deep relationship, and you can just pick up the paper and see it's almost nonstop quarreling and backbiting. All right? You look at Britain, or you look at Canada, countries that the U.S. has been involved in, you look at the history of our relationship, argue, fight. It's been, close when, again, nobody fights more than a married couple. All right? The closer you are, the more things you have to quarrel about. Now, what resolves these is that both of you keep understanding that the things that bring you together are more important than the things about your partner that just drive you crazy, right? So we should not measure the temperature of the Indian-American relationship by are Washington and Delhi having a fight or not. No, that's not the measure of the relationship. In some ways, the less, the United States really does not have a lot of quarrels with, a country that doesn't matter very much to us. Our relationship with Kyrgyzstan, I think, is fairly problem-free at the moment. Not totally, but fairly. So this is something, again, you need a large community who understands the other side so that you can really have those quarrels that a long-term couple is likely to have.
Thank you, Walter. And now I'd like to turn to the audience. Then please wait for the mic to come to you, and then please state your name and affiliation.
Good morning, Aparna. Good morning, Walter. Aparna, namaste ji, kaise ho aap? I'm Chris Orr. First and foremost, I'm a proud Hudson donor. Second of all, I'm a former U.S. Air Force officer, and currently I'm a military and defense aviation writer for simpleflying.com. Having thus self-identified, it probably comes no surprise I'm going to ask an aviation-related question. It goes out to either one of you who wants to tackle it. I was wondering if either one of you could give some comment on the present and future status of the Indian Air Force, particularly their homegrown Tejas fighter jet program, and also the Indian Navy fleet air arm, particularly the status of their aircraft carriers. Thank you. Shukriya, Dhanyabad.
Now, I hate to disappoint you, but I really, I know so little about that I hesitate to even speak.
So Tejas, you're talking about the fact that the GE is going to be building engines for that, or what? What is your question about Tejas specifically?
Well, basically, any knowledge you might have about the status of the program, future, as far as acquisition and.
I believe the GE the MOU was signed. It's moving forward, but both our bureaucracies move very, very fast, and so it will take, I think, 6 months to a year for us to hear anything more. But as of now, there is no update beyond the fact that the MOUs have been signed and approved from both sides.
This is why, you see, she's the expert. I'm the dilettante.
With respect to the Navy, what were your questions, sir?
I guess particularly about the status of the aircraft carriers.
So the indigenous one, so that has been built. Unfortunately, India still needs to have planes for the carrier. So the carrier is built. It doesn't have any jets right now. The process is still going on. So I can provide you, if you send me an email, I can give you some more details. But as of now, the indigenous carrier has been built. There are no jets on it. So technically, India is still using its older aircraft carriers. At the back.
You mentioned modernization, and you also mentioned Hindu. I'm wondering what would be maybe the three top conflicts between modernizing versus historic, the historic faith history, or.
Well, there are many people would take that from different angles, but I think that one would certainly be caste as something that has been present in Hinduism for a very long time. As I understand it, the RSS and the BJP do not see themselves as caste-based organizations, and quite the contrary. And at RSS training camps, you'll find young people of very high caste sort of doing the same sort of kitchen duty and washroom duty that the other kids do together. But it nevertheless is sort of a, what are you, where are you, and aren't you traditional, and why? Say also the complexity of the Hindu tradition makes it quite difficult to, what are the priorities? What are the theological priorities? How do you find a policy foundation, say, for capitalism, or don't you, in Hinduism? I would look at, I look sometimes at what Erdogan has been doing in Turkey as someone who's trying to find in the Turkish Islamic tradition guidance for a modern state. And he's had problems with interest rates, which his sort of cultural grounding leads him to say this is a bad thing. And his inability to manage that has led to trouble. There's also a sense in which a traditionalist party, and we should not just narrowly focus this on religion because it's kind of culture, family, right, is often bound up in sort of rural values or village values. You're going to have to become something that arose primarily in small cities and villages. How does that fit onto a college-educated, modern, middle-class society? And you will hear very interesting discussions among people in that movement about how do you make these things relevant to new generations. And I suppose also there is the sense of Hinduism as having been under attack, for roughly, 1,000 or more years since the first Islamic armies begin to move into what we now think of as India. There was, a long period. So you'll hear people in the Hindutva world talk about double decolonization, that India was colonized by the British, but before that, Hindu India was colonized by Islamic invaders, and that both levels of decolonization need to happen. And you have things like the Ram Temple in Ayodhya as an example of this, that unify some Indians, but not all Indians are united around this, including not all Hindus, by the way. So it's those things, I think, urban modernity versus tradition, caste and communal relations, are things that really people have to work on. And you'll hear a lot of different points of view. And I think there are many currents in this movement.
Mike, up here.
Hi, Aparna, Walter. It's Mike Watson from Hudson Institute. So my question is, when you think of an event occurring somewhere in the world of significance that the United States decides they need to do something about, there tends to be a few capitals that we call to get a sense of, what we should be doing, right? So it's mostly countries that we've got close relations with and that industrialized early. So, London, France, Paris, Berlin, increasingly Tokyo. Does Delhi need to be on that list? And we've talked a little bit about how we need to develop a close relationship. But what needs to be done for that kind of close strategic relationship to develop? Do we need to simply or maybe strictly just get to know each other better? Do we need other kinds of institutions developed? What does that look like?
Yeah, good question. And Aparna, you may have some ideas here too. One thing that does come to mind to me is, I think probably the single greatest example of injustice in the international system today is the fact that according to the sort of rules of the UN, India equals Luxembourg. That is, they both have one vote in the General Assembly, and that's it. This is frankly ridiculous. And so one thing that I would like to see, and unfortunately the Security Council membership is as close to unreformable as anything can be, because all the current members, current permanent members, would have to agree to a change. So one thing I would actually like to see institutionalized is closer U.S.-India discussion about our position as a permanent member of the Security Council. I mean, the United States is going to retain, obviously, its own vote in the United Nations, but I think on key Security Council resolutions, there ought to be a special level of consultation with India over these things. I can also see, I mean, in groups like the Quad, I2, U2, we have begun to institutionalize forms of cooperation. We should remember, too, that India does not want to be a treaty ally of the United States, is not interested in becoming part of some kind of a Indian Ocean NATO or something like that. And so regular informal consultations at high level may be, in many cases, better than sort of trying to establish, EU-style bodies. But I do think having working groups from both governments constantly in contact is something that we need. I'm happy to see that the U.S. Congress, there's a great deal of interest in the relationship in both parties in Congress and in both houses. And so I certainly hope after the Indian election, we'll see a lot more going back and forth between those bodies. But I think at the UN, there might really be something we could do.
I agree. I mean, I like your idea about the informal consultation because sort of since the two countries have never really been allies, those institutions don't exist where you are conferring. And when sort of conferring on small issues helps you do a better job on the bigger ones. So if you confer on almost everything, then you are likely to sort of build those institutions, which in the long run, India will be on, I'd say, speed dial. I won't say Rolodex. Speed dial for U.S. policymakers. But sort of it is something which will have to be built, like Quad has emerged from tsunami, HADR into something bigger today, and the military exercises. I think that will happen. But I agree on even the UN. I know that India is keen, and along with the other three, Japan, Germany, and South Africa, or Brazil. The G4, which are trying to change.
Well, there are a lot of countries, but yeah, I mean, but I do think there's something special about Brazil, India, and Japan. Myself.
Prashant, right at the back.
Thank you so much. This was very insightful. I want to pick up on your thread of the challenges that come with intimacy. And two questions there. One is on the role of the diaspora. The diaspora has been a source of strength for this relationship. But as the fractures of Indian politics start playing out within the Indian diaspora, as segments of the diaspora take up issues which the Indian state sees as a challenge to its own sovereignty and then acts upon, and you know what I'm referring to here. Do you see that becoming affecting American foreign policy? And if you could just help us place this in the wider context of how diasporas have shaped foreign policy. That's one. And the second point is, what I notice is actually a deep level of system convergence between the two sides among policymakers. But that is accompanied by within the public sphere, a lot of noise and a lot of divergence. So I get your point about the quarrel, but do you think that this noise that we hear in the public sphere, both in US and in India among the right and the left, about the US, has the potential of affecting the relationship for the worse?
Well, I would say, if your question is, does public opinion matter to policymakers? The answer is yes. Not always in a simplistic kind of way, but if there is if you have powerful interest groups that are dead set against a certain country or a certain dimension of a relationship, that's an element of friction that has to be overcome. And so, I look, well, I'll give you an example of something that causes a lot of friction in U.S.-India relations, which is that India, like a lot of countries, has pretty strict laws and regulations about foreign funding of domestic NGOs and entities. So whether you are a small Catholic school in Kerala, or you are a development NGO with a policy headquarters in Delhi or whatever, your access to foreign funding, which can be very important for some of these groups, comes under the purview of these laws. Now, I think, unlike some people in the West who think all of these laws are just, horrific and anti-democratic and so on right from the get-go, I would say actually countries where GDP per capita is much lower and have much less wealth than some countries in the so-called developed world or first world, I don't think they should necessarily just have to passively sit there while rich donors in foreign countries provide some elements of the civil society with more resources and sort of tilt the playing field in various ways. So I don't myself see that there's no place for this, though my own beliefs in free speech and free association make me very nervous about any such restriction, but I get it. But I think what has happened to some degree is that these laws have created a coalition in the U.S. of people who don't like each other often very much. So, the very left-wing Ford Foundation and then the American Catholic Church are both angry at the way that the Indian foreign funding regulations and laws affect what they would like to be doing. And because often NGOs and religious organizations have in their hearts charitable purposes, believe that this, whether the rest of us would agree with that those are charitable or not is another question, but they see it that way. And so what they see is the Indian government making it harder to feed little children in the Northeast or something like this. Now that is very problematic because India does, as a post-colonial country, really does have actual bitter experience with foreign power and manipulation of its civil society. And this is often kind of felt at the grassroots level where passions can be very strong and information sometimes is not deep. All right, So, but the problem is that this does create a coalition which over time can become stronger and can start attaching restrictions or in other ways looking mostly through Congress, which is responsive to these kinds of pressures. So, you know, my feeling is that this is the kind of issue where smart Indians and smart Americans should try to sit down and quietly think about these things. And you know, the goal in an international conversation can never really be to remove all friction, because two very different societies will, at the end of the day, make different judgment calls about certain things. But to find ways to make sure that the unnecessary obstacles to deepening cooperation can be reduced to the lowest reasonable level, right? And that, you know, again, that requires both sides leaving a certain amount of baggage outside the room when they go in and talk to each other. And that requires a certain amount of trust. Oh, diaspora. Well, surprisingly, the Indian diaspora, like India itself, is a very complicated thing. And there may be some in India who are sort of hoping that the Indian American diaspora will be this unified force that will, you know, become more and more powerful and push American foreign policy to right where the Indian non-diaspora back home would like it to be. All right? That's not how diaspora politics works. All of the diversity in India is increasingly present in the diaspora. You have many different agendas out there. Some of them, you know, from an Indian point of view, may be relatively benign, some much more deeply problematic. But the United States, of course, can't have one law for members of the Indian American diaspora and one law for another. So advocacy or fundraising activity or other things that are legal under U.S. law are going to be legal for Indian Americans as much as they are for anybody else. And we're not going to change, as a society, we're not going to change our entire constitutional and legal framework to, you know, assuage Indian sensibilities. And at the same time, there are, you know, there clearly is activity that skates close to the edge and goes over the edge of even our rather permissive laws on some cases. Again, trust, leaving baggage outside the room, trying to have important conversations that are not in the floodlights of the press, which is trying to magnify things, but also restraint on both sides. Sometimes I think Indians overestimate Indian vulnerability, and that Indian unity, I think, is actually more secure. I mean, in this sense, I have some good news. I think one can be tolerant of things that are happening in the diaspora without necessarily opening the door. But again, trust is needed, consistent application of law, and hopefully we can develop between many different institutions in both governments the kind of understanding that reduces flare-ups and crises to the absolute minimum, which is probably not zero, but it's worth doing.
The gentleman on the extreme left, the back. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Paul Beckett. I'm an editor at the Wall Street Journal here in DC, and I spent many years reporting from Delhi. You've seen over the last, as you mentioned, over the last 20 years, basically, since George W. Bush and the nuclear détente, every American president tried to bring India closer, as you said. You know, more recently in that relationship, India did not get on side where the United States wanted it to be with Ukraine. It carved out its own special oil cap, and the oil deal has very much stayed on the fence by many of the democratic indexes that you would follow on transparency, freedom of the press, minority rights, religious rights that you mentioned has gone fairly sharply downhill. It's accused of sponsoring a extraterritorial killing on American soil. At what point does all that baggage have to be left outside of the room? I mean, at what point does the United States have to say, we can't just, because it's important to our China relationship, accept all this because India is so important to us? Where is there a point where you can only hold your nose so much?
Well, I think there's, as I'd say, there are. I note that President Biden came into office vowing to make MBS a pariah and to destroy Saudi Arabia, standing in the world. I note that Saudi Arabia is now his great hope for an accomplishment in the Middle East. So I would say that the American tendency is to be too strict and moralistic, not too lax. So that it would have, and I think, by the way, President Biden will end up having to make far more concessions to the Saudis than he would have had he and his administration come into this with a more sane and sensible point of view. On the one, India is a great nation. It is a real force in the world. It really matters. At the same time, there are things in India that create problems for the U.S.-India relationship. And public opinion in the United States doesn't simply follow what a Henry Kissinger might want it to do at a given moment. So I think it is in India's interest as well as America's interest to engage in serious conversations about some of these things. There are, I find myself constantly returning to Reinhold Niebuhr's serenity prayer in international relations. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. This is often a very healthy prayer for diplomats to pray before going into important bilateral conversations.
Right at the last row.
Thank you, Walter. I'm Asanga, a senior fellow from the Millennium Project. My question is coming from Sri Lanka. Recently, Sri Lanka leased out an airport which was built by China to India and Russia. Is there a sort of a strategic intent of India bringing in Russia to the region? And how does the United States view this particular deal, which is leased out 30 years for India and Russia, the two companies? Thank you.
Well, I would say, I can't speak for the U.S. government. You would have to ask them what they think. In general, a small country like Sri Lanka in the middle of intense international rivalries, I find there's been an interesting part of my education, spending more time in Asia in the last 25 years and thinking about South Asia, East Asia, Indo-Pacific more, that neutrality and non-alignment, that neutrality in the Western sense, which is largely a legal framework, and non-alignment, which is a much more popular concept in this part of the world, are kind of different. Non-alignment is often about, okay, neutrality is sort of sitting entirely at home, kind of like Switzerland. I'm not going to join things, I'm not going to, and I'm going to have strict laws about what I will and won't do, and so on and so forth. Non-alignment is more like, okay, I'll give the Chinese enough so that they'll be okay with me, but then I need to give India something too. I need for everybody, all the major players, to prefer their status quo in their relationship with me than to try and push me too hard. And it looks to me like what we're seeing is Sri Lanka is playing this kind of, game, which is, this is what I don't know what the alternative would be. And, so here we are. I'm not myself worried that the Russian Air Force is about to become a major operator in the Indian Ocean. So I would probably say, just from the outside, without any inside knowledge of this, that the Americans would regard the gain for India as outweighing a gain for Russia in that situation. And it's possibly easier for India to do this in partner. India needs ways to assert its independence, both because this is what people believe, but also for public opinion, a government. So India doing things that raise the flag, we are non-aligned, we are India, we are not an ally, we are not a puppet, right, is part of what has to happen. Without knowing a lot of the details, my sense would be this is one of the places where the Americans are probably least worried about India doing the kinds of things that sometimes it needs to do. But I don't know. Aparna, you may know more.
I agree with you. It's more about strategic autonomy. We prefer that to non-alignment these days.
Yeah, that's right. Now, India, right, non-alignment is for small countries that feel weak, right? Strategic autonomy is for strong, big countries. And there is a difference between the two. There is a difference.
French like it as well, so yeah.
Yeah, the French like it a lot.
Yeah. Final question, Akshat, and then we will wrap up.
Thank you, Aparna, and thank you, Walter. Really enjoying this conversation. My name is Akshat Chaturvedi. I'm an international development specialist and a social entrepreneur. And one thing which is not being talked much about, which is India and America's tremendous cooperation into reducing poverty in Africa and a lot of developing countries on climate change agenda. And the Quad, the inception of Quad was to respond to the tsunami that happened. And I think, why do you think that this something is very important to actually make both the audiences, or an Indian audience as well as American audience, feel good about this relationship? Is not much discussed, and most of the issues which we are discussing is all these petty fight between two diplomats.
Well, I agree with you that Indian-American cooperation in poverty reduction and development promotion is a very positive thing, and one that is one of the, and this is not new. Even think about the Green Revolution. In a lot of ways, was a collaboration between Indians and Americans that revolutionized the food situation for billions of people around the world, and we should celebrate that. And we should be paying attention to it. And I think we should note, that India, I think, has a very important role to play in Africa. East Africa is part of the Indo-Pacific. India, long before the British era, the connections between India and this part of the world were deep, going back thousands of years. And it really, reviving this is important for the development of Africa. It's good for India. I also think India in the Middle East can be a real force for peace. I think today there may be more Hindus than Muslims in the UAE. It is that, India's presence is that significant. And so, the Indian expansion in the South, in the Indian Ocean region is important. And as you say, it has vital developmental things. I've written that the BRI, which I see China has moved away from a good deal and is not funding as much, it fit Lenin's definition of imperialism really well, because it was driven by the need for China had excess capacity at home. And so you had all these companies that have been building bridges and highways and railroads and mines and factories and so on in China. And now, because they've overbuilt and have too much, they have no place to go. And so the government makes large loans to enable them to do these things overseas. And then that creates political relations of dependency. And while some of those projects are very good and very useful, the thing driving them was not the needs of the countries, the home countries, it was the need of the Chinese companies that were pushing the project. And so, by the way, the two countries that probably were the most involved with that, of Sri Lanka and Pakistan, are two countries whose financial woes significantly deepened as a result of their entanglement with China. So, so I think if India and America and perhaps some of our other friends, Japan, I think, should certainly be a part of any of this thinking. I think among us, we have developed different approaches to development where we can cooperate. We do see eye to eye. India, as a leading member of what people rather misleadingly call the Global South, has a special role to play in bridging perceptions and creating development possibilities that can take us all to another stage. So I think there is a lot of, and let's hope too, when this terrible war in Myanmar reaches some kind of better place, that let's not forget the reconstruction of Myanmar and helping Myanmar or Burma get out of this terrible trap of poverty and war that really, since independence, has been holding Burma back. That is also a place where I think India, the United States, and Japan could really be constructive.
I mean, India and Japan do have a growth corridor in Africa,
Yes,
actually.
yes.
Going back a long period of time. I mean, India's developmental assistance outside of South Asia primarily goes to Africa and African countries. But on that note, thank you very much, Walter, for this wonderful conversation, and thank you to all of you for coming to Hudson.